Hello, this is Oliver, and I'm here, like usual, doing something that nobody asked me to do but I kind of want to do anyway, which in this case is some kind of breakdown or analysis of the most recent Thrive theme that I've actually managed to finish, the Thrive Society theme. I'm hoping that this could act as sort of a guide for people wanting to compose Thrive music in future, or just any sort of music really, if it's at all possible that my insight into things is in any way insightful. And I hope, I had a lot of fun making this, and I think there's quite a bit going on that can, it can demonstrate things quite well, both in the technical side and the compositional side. So we'll get into that in a minute. For now, I'm just going to check that you all recognise which one this is, and it's the one that goes. And so on. And, you have no idea how hard it was for me to set up the recording of the microphone here alongside Cubase, which I will show you now, assuming that worked. I don't want to open OBS and check because then I'll get the infinite screen thing. So yeah, this is where the magic happens, if you can call it magic. There, along the side here, you'll see there are loads of tracks, each for a different instrument or set of instruments. For instance, where is it? Where did I put them? Oh yeah, it is the drum kit. That's got a whole bank of instruments in it. It's basically a mixer within a mixer. So you've got a mixer here with all of the different things, loads of effects you can add on, but we'll get to those later. Or you could have things that are just individual instruments, such as a viola. That's just one sound. Oh, and also I've got a keyboard connected so I can actually play stuff in, such as woo. And yeah. Down here, this is the mix console. Everything, it gives you an overview of all the tracks and all their respective fader settings, which in common parlance is volume. And you can also click on each of these and you'll see effects on some of them, some EQ, maybe sending to reverbs, and we'll get into all of that later. I'm not sure what kind of level I'm going to do this for, whether it's people completely starting out from new, or whether people may have some kind of experience with working with DAWs, digital audio workstations. So and also there's also that music theory side as well. So if I start talking about minor or major chords or tonalities and whatever, I apologise. I'm going to try and keep it relatively simple, but we'll see what happens. So, I guess we should start at the beginning, shouldn't we? This is the instrument that's kind of the lead for this track. It's a Kora. It's kind of native African instrument, and as we'll go along, we'll find out that I've used a lot of kind of ethnic inspired instruments everywhere, because it is an early society theme. It's meant to be for sort of shortly post-tribal nations working their way up into the industrial stage. So there's actually a lot of Greek influence later on, as we'll see. This, you'll notice, is in an instrument plugin called Contact from Native Instruments, and they do very, very good instrument plugins. I'm very glad that I got the Native Instruments Complete Bundle, which comes with all of these, plus basically the same amount again in another plugin called Reactor, although that's more synth stuff, so that's not really going to come into this one. And then of course there's things like the if I've actually used any, there we go. The default plugins for Cubase, like Helion Sonic, and there's a reverb here, but yeah. So this is the lead instrument, the Kora. If I select it, I can play it. And so the main melody bit, the that sort of came about. The first bit is it's an arpeggiated chord, and it's an arpeggiated B flat minor chord. And if some people ask me, you know, how do you come up with ideas for a track? Where do they come from? How do you start? And in this case, it was literally just me putting my hand on a keyboard and doing this, and then seeing where my fingers went next, which happens to be. And luckily, I remembered that. Because sometimes you do that and you don't remember it, and it's very annoying. But I remembered that, and I built off of it, and kept going, and somehow ended up with an entire track based on that one melody line. So, the melody line itself is... It starts off in B flat minor, or in the key of B flat minor, and sort of hangs on this interval between the C and the D flat, and this kind of leading tone business, it helps create a sort of exoticness in the track and create some tension, and then it resolves back to the B flat. So it starts off with B flat, or a B flat chord, B flat minor chord, goes for a little wander around, you know, in half steps, creating some tension, and then somehow at the end of the phrase comes back to the B flat. And that's just one part of the melody line. And there's kind of a call and response thing. I don't know whether I can call it that, but there's another bit that goes, if I can figure it out just by looking at it. But you can see the notes here have been... I recorded all of these in using the keyboard, by the way. I do that a lot, perhaps even too much, because I do things like recording the drums in some cases, which has its advantages, but for things like drums you want things to be very, very rigid and in time. And, well, even when you're playing stuff in like this, you'll see all of these notes do actually fall on the beat, and that's not because I'm just an amazing piano player or anything. It's because of this thing called quantize, which comes in any audio workstation thing, where you set the division of the bar that you want to snap things to. So here I've got it set to 16ths. These two, for instance, this one isn't on a 16th, this is on a 32nd. So if I were to quantize that, it snaps to the nearest 16th. And, you know, I started working on this track maybe, well, nearly a year ago now. If I were to do it again now, I would have used the iterative quantize, which doesn't fix things very rigidly or perfectly to the beat. It kind of moves them slightly towards it, but not all the way. So it puts it further in time, but kind of gives it a bit of a more organic feel, which when you're working with acoustic instruments like this is what you want, really. But I think this one comes off quite well with an organic feel, and mostly that's due to all of the different velocities here. So a big mistake I see amateur musicians or amateur producers making all the time is to just draw all the notes in like this. If I were to do that now, that was an interesting melody. So if I were to do that, and then they just leave it, and you'll notice the colour of all of these notes relates to how loud they are. So you have a note here that's quite quiet. Compare that to, that's a slightly louder one. I don't think there are many extremes here, but you get the picture. So what new people tend to do is they kind of draw things in with all of the same velocities everywhere, and that just creates kind of static, boring, robotic texture, which you don't really want unless you're creating static, boring, robotic music. And if you are doing that, keep at it. So let's get rid of those. I kind of went off on a tangent there, but I was going to talk about the second part of the melody, this bit. Something like that. But you'll notice there's this bit here where it goes to a D, just a normal D note. Now, you don't need to know a massive amount of music theory here, but just know that in the key of B flat minor, or yeah, I guess it's B flat minor, natural minor. The D, if you have a D note anywhere, it's always flattened to a D flat, and then you end up with. Oh. I forgot that this instrument only has a limited range over the keyboard, and if you go beyond it, it starts playing different stuff. But yeah. So anytime, normally, if you're playing in like a key, in this key, anytime you play a D, you would play a D flat. So the D natural, it comes as a bit weird. And if you were to like hang on the D natural for a while, it would come off as very weird indeed. But what happens here, it's kind of a passing tone between the D flat and the F. And that makes it fit more naturally into everything, really. But the fact it's there does kind of emphasise the element of exoticness and otherworldliness, because the scales used in ethnic music are very different. Well, they're not very different, but they're different to the ones that we use in the West. And it's sometimes difficult to kind of evoke those sounds on Western instruments. And one way to do that is just to insert notes outside a key. Like this. And then we have... So it's the same phrase as the start, but there's a slight change in the fourth quarter, I guess, of the phrase. Because you'll notice over here, we'll go right back to the start. So you have this dum 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 bit at the end of the first phrase, whereas here it goes up instead. It goes right down to the B flat down here, and then up, and then that leads into the fourth part of the phrase. And it kind of prepares you for it a bit more than if you just didn't have these notes. So I guess we'll see what happens there. And that actually reminds me of another thing I see a lot of amateurs doing, or at least people who making music for Thrive, sort of their first attempts at making music. And that's making melodies that kind of start on the beat and finish on the beat, if you get my drift. So if I didn't have those there, I guess this is a very syncopated rhythm, so it's not really very easy to demonstrate that here. But if you had a rhythm that I don't know, that's a very straight rhythm because everything happens. The emphasized notes are on the first beat, and you never get anything like this note here that kind of you intuitively think it arrives on at the start of the bar here, but that's not what happens. And if it were to happen there, it would sound very weird. And this is the technique called syncopation. It's where you play a note before the note should actually be there. And this is everywhere in modern music. It was actually quite rare until a couple of 100 years ago. You don't see it a lot in classical music, but it's everywhere in pop music and rock music. And that's a good way of creating melodies with a lot more interest. You add syncopation everywhere, and don't just keep... I mean, that's an okay melody, but it's a bit boring. It's not got much heart to it. It's just going round and round. So yeah, add some syncopated phrases, some lead-ins. This is circling back around to the point I was going to make. This acts as a lead-in to this note here, this phrase. So it's kind of this part of the melodic phrase doesn't start at the start of the bar, it starts slightly before it, and that again adds more interest, more organicness, if you will. I've spent, oh god, I don't even know how long I've been recording for, and I've spent all that time analysing 10 bars. 10 bars on one instrument, wow, we're going to be here a while, sorry. Now you may ask, was I thinking about all of this as I made this melody? No. Most of this, I've just looked at this melody in here and applied what I know about how melodies generally work. When I first created this melody, I didn't think about that at all. I was literally just messing around on a keyboard and got... and so on. You kind of... I guess my point here is you kind of have to develop an intuitive understanding of melodies. You can, I guess, but it's probably not preferential to... You can think in detail about, from a very music theoretic perspective, about every note you put down. You know, is this going to modulate properly to the next bit? Is this going to sit well with that note or whatever? Or you can improvise, come up with something good, and then maybe clean it up a bit using what you actually know about music theory. And to improvise well, you do need to have a good understanding of music theory, because you need to know, you can, for instance, the way I do it is I look at a keyboard and I remember what sort of shapes of chords I can go to from any particular chord. So if I go from a B flat minor, I know that that's quite closely related to the G flat major, for instance. And, you know, when you look at it, it's quite obvious. They share two notes. And this is a very simple example, but there are other ones, like you can go from B flat minor to F minor quite easily, because it shares one note and the others just go up one step in the scale of B flat minor. But you kind of look at it and you think intuitively about what you can do from there. I'm not sure if it's really possible to teach that sort of thing, you just need to practice it. And I'm not entirely sure how I ended up with that ability, but I'm happy I have. So yeah, most of the melodies you hear in all of my stuff recently was to some extent improvised, just recorded in based on something I'd made up. Well, everything's made up. But yeah, just recorded in without much thought. And it's when I come to... We'll come to a bit later where I had to think a bit more about the music theory. But yeah, so that's the first bit. That's the main melody. That's what the entire track is built around. Oh yeah, coming away from music theory a bit. If we look, these are all the effects that are applied to this particular track. And we've got a compressor here. And it's a bit difficult to explain what a compressor does in a short amount of time. I will try. It basically, in any sound, you will have peaks and troughs. So bits where it's louder and bits where it's quieter. And what a compressor does, it kind of squishes those bits together. Not exactly in that way, but that's the effect of it. So if I play quietly, this is a measure of how much it's actually acting at a particular time. If I play quietly, it's not doing anything. If I play quite loud, it's reducing the volume, and that helps keep put a track, keep it together a bit more, because otherwise you could have wild peaks everywhere, which doesn't sit well with other instruments. So that's what a compressor does. I've actually got a reverb here that I've turned off. I guess that must have been from right at the start, when I put a reverb on this track and then transferred the reverb to an effects channel later. This EQ is a very powerful tool, and what it does is it changes the frequency content of a sound. So if I solo this track and play it, you can see all the frequency data in what's playing at a time, and I can draw on this and move around new bits and you'll see what happens. And then I can change the width of the band. And you can use that sort of effect of a filter sweep to create quite interesting effects, but it's not really useful in this track because it doesn't fit the aesthetic of, acoustic, tribal sort of instruments. In an electronic track it would be quite useful. And then here I've got a send, so it's passed through the compressor, the sound, it's passed through the compressor through the EQ, where I've chopped off the low end, which helps it sit better in the mix, reduced the high end a bit because I think that was a bit too punchy, if I remember rightly. And then I've taken that sound that comes out the end here and sent it both as itself to the stereo out, but also a bit of it goes to the reverb up here. And what reverb is, it's like it simulates the sound being in a room. So this reverb is built on impulse responses, which are recordings of just very simple sine waves, or not even waves, just sound clicks, sine clicks, bouncing off walls in an environment, and you apply that to any sound and it sounds a bit like it's in there. And so you'll see if I solo this track, it keeps the reverb soloed as well because the signal is passing into the reverb unit. I can turn it off, I can mute them independently, but generally it's quite good, The reason I have a reverb as a separate effect is you want things to kind of mesh together well by sending them all to the same reverb, and but because that's sort of it gives the illusion of them all being in the same space. If you give them all different reverbs with different lengths, different characteristics, it can get a bit messy and they don't sound like they're together, and sometimes that can be exactly what you want. But here that wasn't what I wanted, so I stayed away from that. I should probably move on, shouldn't I? Let's go with this bit. So this is when a few more instruments join the party. We have a low string line here. And actually when you solo that string line it sounds a bit terrible. I'm not really much of a fan of sampled strings, I will be honest, because, I don't know, maybe it comes from listening to a lot of classical music, but strings are incredibly expressive instruments. You have violins and cellos, they can play very elaborate stuff with lots of articulations everywhere. And when you just record them in like this, with samples that are made to be, even like high quality samples from native instruments, they're still made to be kind of general purpose samples, and as a result they don't have the expressiveness that you really want from a string line, unless it's something like this which sits in the background, then it's alright. But for me personally, I don't like using strings unless they're doing that, although there is an exception later and we'll get to that, I hope, if I remember. So yeah, we have what this string line is doing, it's tracing out the bass notes of chords which may or may not fit with the main melody line here. So you notice I said right at the start that it starts on a B flat minor chord, and yet the bass note here is an E flat. that's because, you know, B and E flat, or B flat and E flat, they're quite closely related. They're a fifth apart on a piano. So they can, in some cases, be substituted for each other without too much dissonance, and it actually creates some interesting colour for a chord to add a note underneath it that's not actually part of the chord. But then it goes down to a D, and this is interesting because, as I said earlier, B flat minor. If you add a D instead of a D flat, you get B flat major. So in a sense, there's a kind of pivoting on the B flat, but changing between a minor and a major chords. But it's a minor chord with an E flat in the bass as well, just to complicate things. I can't play that on one hand. So the reason I did this is it kind of gives a sense of otherworldliness, I guess. When you, as I said earlier, as I explained quite some detail earlier and probably shouldn't go into again for time constraints, but adding like a note outside every key like this can make it sound a bit more ethnic, give it some colour. Then back to the E flat, then down to the B flat. So at the end of the phrase, it goes down to the chord that it's actually supposed to be on, which gives it some sense of finality. We've got this oud instrument is interesting. And this is another thing that you can do with melodies. So, oh, it's not. They're kind of in the same range. Hold on. Move that up. It's a bit more visible. So, you have this Kora doing some melodic thing for most of the bar, and then it's you could probably agree that its main area of melodic interest is this area of the two bars over which that phrase goes. So once that finishes, you can insert some melodic part of another instrument. So that doesn't really work because I changed the octave in which this is. So yeah, you've got like on one instrument, and then at the end of the bar it changes to dun dun on another instrument, and that is quite an effective way of changing between melodies in different instruments. You give them different parts of a bar, and if you've ever got some melody with a lot of free space in it and it feels a bit bland, add a counter melody with another instrument doing something like this. So playing stuff whenever the first instrument is silent. And you can end up with some interesting stuff that way. And the way this flute and the Kora interact is quite interesting as well, because for the most part they are playing exactly the same thing. Like all of these notes are overlapping, and that's because, you know, I copied it over. I cheated. But then I decided, well, I could do something a bit more interesting with it. And you'll notice the melodies differ very slightly here and here. Whenever you see things that are slightly grayed out, that's where they're different. Excuse me. So this is an example of what's called heterophonic movement in a melody, where you've got two things that are playing very similar things, but they're slightly different. And you can hear that when it plays. So you had this Kora is going dun 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 dun, whereas the flute is doing something else at the time. Yeah, so bum 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 ba ba-dum, ba 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 ba-dum. It's very subtly different, but it is different, and it gives it it's another technique for adding, you know, a sense of humanity to the playing. I'm just gonna check that we are still recording. Good. Good. So yeah. So that bit runs through, it's the same melody again, but this time with a few things behind, with that counter melody stuff going on. Also, there's something else here. It doesn't matter. I'm taking far too long with all of this anyway. But yeah, then it comes to the end of that bit. And you end up with this Kora just playing a solo line on its own. And this was actually inspired by a piece called the Epitaph of Sikelos. Sikelos? Don't know how to pronounce it. It's Greek. But it's, I think, the oldest piece that we have a complete melody for, and there's a recording of it which I really like, because it's just, well, half of it is a string instrument playing on its own, the other half is a string instrument with a woman singing alongside it. But it just, the way it's recorded, it's got a lot of reverb on it. It's quite quiet, and you can tell it's in the distance, and that gives it a very kind of ethereal feeling. And I wanted to kind of evoke that here, but also had to make a balance between keeping it ethereal and then fitting it with the rest of the track, which isn't so much. And if I click on this, there's a lot, or well, a few kind of lead-in notes. So for instance here, instead of playing just a chord, or even going from one note to the other, I play a couple of chords a couple of notes in between. So what notes are they? And what that does, it kind of it imitates the style of people who actually play these instruments, because there's a lot of kind of finger picking and sliding between notes going on there. And obviously I can't play these instruments, so I don't have an intimate knowledge of how they work. But I can kind of, in some cases, kind of imitate those, I guess. Oh, you may not even be able to see that. But yeah, there's one note there. And that's another one that's kind of the brung instead of a ba bam ba bam. You get a ba bam ba brum, which is, another kind of a way that plucked string instruments are usually played. This oud line here is interesting, because it comes from low to high, and if I'm honest, I probably overuse that quite a bit. This sort of dun 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 dun, where you have like 3 notes going up in a triad or some fifths in the bass. And there's actually a piece I'm working on at the moment, which I'm hoping to get done, which kind of uses that as part of its core motif. So yeah, I should probably get away from that a bit. But here it's a good example, because it kind of it's a cheap way of fading in, because our ears are more attuned to the notes around this sort of range, or at least this sort of range on this instrument. So we hear those as clearer and louder, as opposed to these ones. And these notes are themselves definitely louder anyway, because, higher velocities. But the fact that this fades in from below, it kind of feels like it's a less intrusive way of introducing another instrument. Because you have a solo instrument playing here, it would be quite jarring to just suddenly have like a chord from this played quite loudly. Whereas doing this with an arpeggio, it sort of spreads it about a bit, I guess. Interestingly, this whole bit here, it pivots on E flat minor. So the key of the piece is definitely B flat minor, but here it goes up to the 4 chord, F E flat minor, which kind of gives it a sense of, I don't know, melodic harmonic movement, I guess. Then it repeats the phrase again, kind of, but this, I think the ude's doing exactly the same thing, but the Kora is doing something different. And here, once again, in the so we go from an F major chord, one of the inversions, I never know which one is which, to what could be considered, I guess, an inverted F suspended 4th chord. And that's another example of like semitonal movement from... So yeah, basically I'm overusing that here. But it's a good thing to overuse in this case because it works. And then we go into that same section again, but with more instruments, some atmosphere stuff. It should be noted that this instrument, it was a preset combination of some instruments in Cubase's native instrument sampler, Halion Sonic. So it's got, does it even tell me what these are? It's got, oh yeah, there it does. Nylon guitar, a harp, and a choir. I think I took the choir out of it because it was annoying me. But the other two are there. Oh, and you've got harmonium as well. So if we solo this, it's very watery, very flowy, as a kind of contrast to the very heavy plucked Kora that's playing the main melodies. And that sort of contrast is very useful because it allows your ear to pick up things from each other when they're playing at the same time. And it's here we also get the first percussion. So there's like a little lead-in from some bells here. And I think, I'll be honest, I think I was a bit lazy and basically made all of these play the same thing for the most part. With some exceptions, because you can probably see it from looking at here. There's a bit here. And another bit there, where there's just like a bongo fill. And that doesn't happen in every single repetition of this phrase. So it's not in this one, it is in this one, not that one, is in that one, not that one, is in that one, and so on. And it's good to get those kind of percussion variations in, and to be honest, I don't do that enough. I should do that more. Because percussion especially, you don't notice it as much, but it is still there, and you can notice when it gets repetitive. And especially when other things fade out, or at least have a pause, as they do at the end of this phrase. So you have the dring as a lead into the next 4-bar phrase, and alongside it you have this bongo fill. And that kind of, it adds more interest once again. And then here, this is a good example of adding variation to stuff, because another thing that I've seen people do a lot when they submit Thrive music is they put stuff in that doesn't have enough variation. You know, they've got maybe a good motif, a good melody to start off with, but they overuse it to hell. It runs through the whole track, maybe they add some more layers and more melodies on top of that, but it just gets a bit boring. it's kind of it's a very good indicator of whether you're experienced with this stuff or not. And I was definitely guilty of this in my old days, you know. So many of my early tracks would be made by just layering stuff on top of one melody. Sometimes that could work. It's a common feature, for instance, I think house music, you end up where you have a chord sequence that you put a melody over the top. There was a recent piece of mine, These Constants into Morning, where I basically did that. But I added variation in the instrumentation over the top. So you had this one constant of the chord sequence underneath, and things were changing over the top. So it's kind of a mix of familiarity and novelty, and you need to keep that mix. You need to balance those two together in some way. You can't lean to one side or the other too much, otherwise it's either going to be too boring or too complicated. So this here, my point is, this is an extra melody that's kind of added to the background here. Because by this time you've heard this melody many times and maybe it's getting a bit boring. So you add this one in and it gives it a bit more flavour. And it's low in the mix, it's quite subtle, but it's there. And it helps add a bit more flavour to it. It shows that you're not just repeating the same stuff over and over again. So now we get into the second chorus, if you like. In my mind it's a chorus because the Kora is kind of the vocal substitute. It's the one that gets all the good parts, and the one your ear attaches to most. And it's a chorus because it's the main motif again, back from the start, here again. This time there's some extra instrumentation that you can notice with these drums, but that you probably wouldn't notice the basses there, at least right at the start. And just like the strings earlier, it does this kind of walk downwards from E flat to D to B flat. And this kind of octave jump in bass is something I like to do a lot. You'll notice it a lot in my music. But the bass is kind of subtle for most of this chorus until the end. So if you listen for a bit. And suddenly you notice it a bit more when you've got these octave jumps coming in. And the reason for that is the texture's thinned out quite a bit. And I've added another instrument, a kalimba, in here, just as a kind of what's the word? I don't even remember what the word is, but it contrasts the bass. So the bass obviously covers the bass registers, whereas to fill it out a bit more and to add some contrast, you add the kalimba in the high registers, the treble stuff. And because they operate in different registers, you can pick them out quite easily. Another thing that I did quite a lot when I started out, and people who make music for Thrive as sort of starting out also do, they tend to layer a lot of the same stuff that works in the same frequency range on top of each other. This is not the best idea because it becomes quite hard to pick them all out and you just get a mush. If you must layer things, give them different frequency ranges to deal with. So, you know, you've had a bass to cover the low end, add some hi-hats maybe to cover the high end, put some stuff in the middle. You can, you know, it's not a hard and fast rule. You can put things in between, put them over the top. Separating stuff is also possible via panning, and I don't think I've mentioned much of that yet. There's this here is the panning. So this one's, the oud for instance, is panned quite far left. I'm hoping you can hear that. panning is another thing I need to do more. Yeah, we'll get to those later. Should we spend some time talking about the effects on the bass? Probably not. I think this is basically a preset in Guitar Rig for a bass. Like this bass instrument. Oh no, Electric Bass VX. I thought it was another one. There's a bass in Helion Sonic that I use all the time. It's my favourite bass. It's multi-electric. It just sounds so realistic. I like it a lot. But this one works for the circumstances. Obviously, not exactly an ethnic instrument, but it doesn't break your immersion too much, I hope. Because it doesn't dominate. It doesn't dominate your perception of it. As I've mentioned, it's quite subtle. It just helps to mark out the chord changes a bit more. Now we get to the interesting bit. And this is first we'll deal with the melody bits. You've got the flute and the kalimba, again playing kind of heterophonic versions of the main melody, but this time without the Kora there. And this is another way you can add variation by changing up the instruments that are playing the same thing. And you notice, this is an entirely different melody in some places, even though it's the same in others. So this bit is the same. This is completely different. The same. Completely different. So yeah, that's heterophonic movement again. The drums. Now, I was a bit, I don't know, can I call myself lazy again here? But with these drums, the main pattern, I guess, is this one. Bum 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 bum, and that's actually based off an actual Greek rhythm, which I can't remember the name of, and I probably should have looked up before doing this, but oh well. So yeah, you hear it kind of in normal version here. Obviously the ancient Greeks wouldn't have played this with a drum kit. But that doesn't mean you can't use the melodies, or rhythms rather. So what I did that was perhaps a bit lazy here was I just recorded this entire block in, I think, in one go. Maybe I recorded the hi-hats separately. But yeah. And that's why in this first bar it's not quite the same rhythm. So you hear it this time it's dum ta 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 ta, whereas here it's dum ta 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 ta. So you can see it visually. This one, the snare comes in before the final beats, whereas this one, the first snare comes in on the final beat. And that's just an artifact of me playing it in and recording it instead of just drawing stuff. But sometimes that can add some more rhythmic variation, which you otherwise wouldn't have had. So I think it's basically the same thing most of the way through. And then at the end of, I do these all the time, it's like small drum fills up to bigger drum fills at the end of other phrases. And then it mellows out again at this section of the melody, which it mellows out every time this melody section plays. and then again there's a bigger drum fill at the end of this bit. Now these drums, this is my own preset for drums that I've saved. It's based on, I guess, the studio drummer in Contact, the indie rock preset, I suppose. But I think I messed around with this because I found I like my drums with a lot of room. So these are the room mics, which are kind of, when you record a drum kit, you close mic all of the different the drums. So you put a microphone next to the snare, microphone next to the kick, and so on. But you also put overhead mics. And I found both in this and in times when I've actually recorded proper drums, that was when I was doing like A-level music technology, I quite like the sound of the overheads, perhaps even more so than the close mic drums. So I turned those up a bit here, and also sent it a lot to reverb, because I know this is quite a reverb heavy preset, I guess. But then I saved this as my own preset, and I've used this a couple of times. I think it appears in Not Your Idea of Fun. There's some other stuff that I'm working on at the moment that it's in. So yeah, look out for this again, this sort of sounds. Now, there's also a stereo enhancer on here because I like playing with width. Maybe what I lack in panning, I make up for in width and placement stuff. So what this does, it changes how wide the sound feels, as you might expect. So, like this, it's pretty wide. I can make it slightly wider, but you probably can't tell. On the other hand, I can make it a lot narrower. And you know, both those settings have their places. Sometimes it's quite an interesting sound to have it in mono, when you just have it, you know, ridiculously narrow. Other times you want a big, powerful drum kit that's very wide. And then there's a compressor over the top here. And the EQ here is interesting, because there's just this one cut around 75 Hz, and that came from comparing this with the bass. So it's a common technique when you're doing any sort of music that involves both bass and drums, to look at where the low end frequencies of the bass and the kick are sort of concentrated. So for the bass, the highest peaks are around 50 to 70, 100 Hertz, whatever. Whereas if you're talking about the kick on the drums, that's a bit lower, that's around 40 to 50. So what I did, and I guess there's another centre of like drum attention around here. So in order to kind of reduce the busyness of a track, what you can do is take a slab out of the kick and around the frequency that the bass is most prominent, and do the same in reverse with the bass. So take a slab out of the bass to bring out the kick a bit more. And if this seems a bit, you know, I may have gone a bit too advanced here, but this is just a general principle to think about when working with instruments that have differing or similar frequency ranges. You want to kind of make them prominent in some areas but less prominent in others. Sometimes taking away from one instrument is better than adding to another one. So just keep that in mind. And obviously on the bass here I took out a load from the high end because you don't need that on a bass. Unless, well, sometimes you do. If you have a particularly interesting like acoustic bass sound with a lot of, I don't know, fret noise or whatever, and you want to bring that out, then you can keep the high end in. But in this case I didn't. So then we go back into the, I guess, kind of B phrase. So we have the A phrase of and so on, and then we have this B phrase. but this time again with the drums backing it, so it gives it more variation. It's a different kind of feel to before. So we've gone, with this B phrase, we've gone all the way from just having a Kora on its own to full instrumentation over here. And it's the same drum line, just truncated here. So if I've, it's been cut up a bit to remove that like last bit of that section. Otherwise, it's mostly the same. Strings and atmosphere are the same. You've got the oud bits here. There's an extra oud bit here that just adds some extra variation. Right. It's quite difficult to hear. So yeah, that's another example of just having a subtle melody in the background to create more interest. At the same time, we've got this piano. So it kind of takes the first part of the Kora phrase and repeats it, whereas the Kora goes off and does other stuff. And there you go, that's that turnaround from the B flat. Although I guess, yeah, here it's the G flat major, which, as I mentioned, closely related to B flat minor, so they go together quite well. You do that, and that's closely related to E flat minor. So that's how you can get between those two chords in an easy way. And then there's this kind of a movement, the passing tone of an F in the middle of the G flat and the E flat. And I believe, but I can't quite remember, this may have been like one of the first bits I ever recorded. I think I recorded this before I did this bit. And this was kind of like okay, I'll listen to this, see how it goes, and then maybe change it up when I record it in again for this bit. And then I had no piano in it for quite a while. And it was only towards the end and I thought, I could put it back in. It still works, and I think it does. End of the phrase turn from a kalimba here. Now here's the bit where harmonically at least it starts getting very interesting, because this whole bit has definitely been in B flat minor, because you have B flat minor, then it goes to G flat major. I should probably represent these on the keyboard somewhere. See over here. All those chords are closely related together. They're all in the key of B flat minor. They're all kind of standard chords in B flat minor. But then, out of nowhere, if you look at these notes, they're playing B flat major. This time with a G in there as well for some reason. But what that does, it signals the fact it's a variation. When you have some kind of I guess a blinding chord change like that. So it starts off with B flat major. And it kind of pivots on the B flat but the chord beneath it changes completely. Oh, I guess. Oh, that's not it at all. What am I doing? Yeah, it goes back to a B flat minor, but with an E flat, I guess, here. And then still pivoting on the B flat with a couple of turns here. And I think I was humming and hawing about keeping this rhythm the way it is, these sort of rhythms, because they're very out of time, but yet they still work, because they sound like, you know, an ethnic music player would play. They sound very, what's the word, authentic. And at this point, the chord changes to an F, I guess an F minor? And then down to a C major 7th? Yeah. Yeah, C major 7th. Which is completely out there, because it's got both an E natural and a B natural. And you remember earlier I mentioned about the E flat and the B flat, how they're like these, some of the central notes of the B flat minor scale. And somehow we've ended up in a place where moving to a chord with both of these shifted up a semitone is fine. And I'm not sure how I did that, but I'm happy I did, because it works. And it's an interesting harmonic sort of progression. And then, so from the C, you modulate up. Oop, what did I do there? Modulate down, I guess, because it's kind of it feels like a downward movement down to the G minor, which again adds more colour. And finally, this melodic line here, it stops pivoting on the B flat and then goes down to the G flat instead. The G, sorry, instead. And you remember I mentioned that we've turned the E flat and B flat into E natural and B natural. Well, this chord kind of goes halfway back. It turns the B back into a B flat. It doesn't tell you what it does to the E. You just kind of have to think about that. Your brain fills in the gaps. But then, right at the end of this phrase, so it's still pivoting on the G, and this is a good way to change between chords that are in different keys and maybe don't work together, is to take one particular note that's common to them and sort of keep that constant as you move between them. But then, if we go and look at another instrument that kind of gives us the chords a bit better, this is an E minor chord. So somehow we've gone from this to this. And I got to this point. So up to this point, right? Most of this I made half a year ago, 3/4 of a year ago. And I got to this point and I was stuck. I gave up. I couldn't figure out, because I got from B flat minor to E minor in kind of a quasi-natural way, and I could not for the life of me figure out how to get back. So I was stuck there for ages. Anything I put at the end here it felt very off. It felt kind of, how best to describe it? It didn't fit with the tone of the rest of the track. You know, because I was trying to get back to B flat minor because I knew I wanted to put the other bits in later, the bits from the start. But any way I tried to do that felt very forced and very out there, and didn't fit at all. So for ages, I didn't even have the bass there. For ages, it ended like that. and I was completely stuck as to what to do next. One thing I did do to kind of remedy that was to have the bass kind of move in tandem with this Kora line. Dun, 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 dun. And since the bass is introduced or reintroduced there, it feels a bit more natural moving into the next section. But in the end, I just decided to hang on with the E minor chord for a bit. So you notice this is on an E, it stays there. Just some twiddling about, E minor, more twiddling about. And it suddenly gets a bit more major as it goes up to here, I guess, with a G major. And that's kind of a weird transition there, because the D stays the same between the G major and the B flat major, but otherwise it's all a bit odd. Because for instance, you go from a B in a G chord to a B flat in a B flat chord, but since it's arpeggiated with these kind of like, it works. You know, if you go from the straight chord, it's very jarring and can work in some cases, but not here. So having it played in an arpeggiated way works a bit better. And now at least we're back to B flat. We're in B flat major as opposed to B flat minor, but we're getting there. And now here, I will admit I did cheat. Yeah, think about this sample pack. It comes with like pre-made phrases. So I don't even know what, well, I can't tell what notes are playing just from this note that I've put here because it triggers a sequence of events rather than a particular note. But I felt, you know, sometimes this is a good strategy to think about these things. You should play around and then stick with whatever works. So I was just messing around and I found that as a good transition into the next phrase. And I decided, well, I like that, I'm going to make it a bit more prominent. And what I did, I worked out what notes they were and I put them in the oud. So, as you can see here, it turned out to be... So this, a bass going from C to D flat, and then kind of a switching between C and F here. So we go from, I guess, B flat to an F, or an F minor, and that acts as our transition back to the B flat minor, which comes in a moment. And this is back to the B section again. Well, it's kind of the B section because you've got the piano plays exactly the same bit as it did before. But meanwhile, we've got the Kora doing something different. So it starts off as it was, with just a plucked B flat note, but then it subverts your expectations by doing a completely new melody. So you do that, and then it slowly builds tension. I think that bit's my favourite bit of the whole track, really. Because what I did here was I took pretty much every instrument I could, or most of them, and made them play the same thing. And that's a good way of like creating tension at a certain point, by having everything suddenly go from playing different things to the same thing. And then in the second half of that phrase, you have the bass coming in doing the same thing. So it's kind of a transition. At first, I had the bass coming in right from the start of this bit, and it felt a bit jarring. But having things playing things it plays the first half of the phrase together, and then the bass comes in the second half, and that kind of makes it creates a smoother transition in a way. Meanwhile, most of the drums fade out, or they disappear. I couldn't find the word, so I'd use a different one. And are replaced with some sort of fill. And meanwhile, you've got it's a saxophone. It doesn't sound like a saxophone. Okay, it sounds like a saxophone when you play it on its own, but in the context of the track, you can't tell. So yeah, you can't tell that your immersion is being broken, that it's a tribal song, because there's a saxophone in it. And with this saxophone, it's actually quite interesting. So you see here, this is pitch bend. And I just love doing that sort of thing. Where I record that in live as well with the pitch wheel on my keyboard, and that, you know, I like bending between notes because it creates. It's a way of making it sound more organic, less static. So as the rest of them are doing that phrase, that big phrase in the background, you also have this bit. Panned to the left, you should note, because it separates it from the rest of that and therefore makes it a bit more prominent. And as the phrase goes on and gets more tense as the bass jumps in as well, this pitch bends down to kind of give like a, I guess, even kind of a scary feel. Sounds a bit torturous, doesn't it? So you get that. And now, I mentioned these earlier, how I don't like using string samples. This is mostly when I'm using sustain samples. So that's when you have like long held string notes on something. The reason these work, where the viola and the viola and the violin, the reason those work is those aren't sustain samples. It's something, because with these plugins from Native Instruments, you can choose the sort of sample by key switch. So you can have the one I've got here is forte piano, which, as you might expect, is loud and then quiet. And that sounds a lot more natural than, I guess, a sustained one. Because the sustain's kind of, the way it attacks, it kind of feels a bit forced. It's a bit artificially long. It doesn't feel like there's an actual person playing it. It feels like it's a sample, whereas this, it's a bit more lifelike. And there's one plugin which I've yet to actually use in a published track that actually allows you to record bow movements for violin, and so you can create better, I guess, more organic sounding strings in a way, rather than just relying on samples and trying to fit those to your need. You can create the movements yourself. And it's interesting because that plugin is actually a synthesizer. There's no samples in it at all, and yet it sounds more like a violin than most sampled violins, just because of the way it relies on bow movement rather than just playing notes. Because you don't, when you're playing a violin, you don't play notes like you do on a piano, like You have to worry about where the bow's going, whether it's sliding between notes, whether you just pick it up and move it, you know, where your finger's moving up and down the string to shorten or lengthen it. So, yeah, not sure what else I was going to say there. In summary, that's kind of why I ended up using these two. And they work quite well, because this one's panned left, this one's panned right, this one takes the low octave, this one takes a higher octave. And you'll notice here again another pitch bend bit. And then for the second part of that phrase, they play exactly the same thing, which is incidentally that oud melody from earlier that I quite liked. With a few bits in between to make it sound a bit more natural when it's played by something more prominent. And also here, actually this is what I was talking about right at the start. Here you will notice they're all shifted a bit. And I believe, yeah, so I didn't quantize these exactly, did I? No, I think I did, but then I moved them a bit forward. Because the way the sample works, or when you play, even though it comes in hard at the start, there is still a bit of fade in. And you have to account for that when you're recording something like this. So I didn't when I recorded it, I just quantized it, and it sounded very slightly off, like it wasn't in time with the rest of the instruments. So I moved every note forward by the same amount, and it actually compensated for that. And here we've got the strings playing exactly the same thing, an octave apart. It's that main melody from earlier, but with some variation in it, with some extra notes in to make it bigger, more important, which signals that it is like the climax of the track. And then there's contrast here because everything fades out and you have the cymbal crash. Bit cliche, but oh well. And in the background you've got this thing, which was like a free instrument from somewhere or other. That, you know, it has the word ethnic in the name, of course I was going to use it in this. It's an ethnic Armenian instrument called a duduk. Again, that's me messing around with a pitch bend. And a bit of modulation here as well. And I was quite lucky here, I think. Was that pitch bend? Yeah, it was, because I played this in at first and I recorded the pitch bend and I made a mistake here. Because I didn't want it to sit on this kind of note in between. I wanted it to go straight from this one to this one. But it actually works. It was a happy accident, as Bob Ross would say. And actually I quite like that, because it adds to the sense that everything's fallen out and it's a bit chaotic at this point. And then because everything has gone, apart from like the treble wind instruments and the Kora, the piano and the drums. The drums playing a very sparse arrangement to this point. When the chorus comes back in again, it feels very big, even though it's not actually that much bigger than when it was before. And I also decided to emphasise that kind of dun dun bit with a bass. The bass comes in, there's a crash on that bit as well. And that helps as well. And then you go into the same bit as earlier, but with this tremolo pipa. Yeah. And I've had this for ages. You can go back, this is a free plugin I found somewhere, and you can go back to like 2013 and find me using it on tracks. I quite like it. And then because it's this big, powerful ending bit here, what I like to do is I add a stereo delay. on things. And what this does is it creates duplicates of the sounds in each ear, but slightly delayed between them. And the way our ears work, we detect how wide something is by the delay between them, if that makes sense. So, you know, in nature, that's very useful, because if you hear something, our ears use that delay to pick out where something is in relation to us. And if you're evading a predator, you probably need to know where they are by sound. But we can hijack this when we're creating music. It doesn't work so well on this instrument, I guess, because it's kind of like a bit more subtle. But yeah, there's a delayed version pan to each side, and it makes it sound a lot wider than it would be at normally. And you remember I showed you that stereo enhancer thing earlier. That does a different thing. I think that's something about panning different frequency ranges. But this one makes it sound a lot bigger. And I can mess with the delay to change. And at some point it stops sounding like a single sound and becomes an actual delay. But at small values, you can't tell. You think it's just a single sound that's really wide. And that's an artifact of how our ears work. So this bit, when in other instances things have kind of mellowed out a bit, it's become calmer again. Here I decided to go for broke a bit with the drums. And I am very much a sucker in pieces and tracks I listen to for this kind of like taiko sound, taiko, however you pronounce it. This bit. I think the best use of it I've heard. There's a track from the soundtrack to Avatar: The Last Airbender called "The Last Agni Kai," where it's most of the track is built on this sort of pattern with a kick, and then, I don't know whether you can call it a kick because it's kind of like an ethnic boom, and then it's a taiko, high treble taiko in reply. And that, I will admit, was a direct inspiration for this bit here. And that's a good point about inspiration here, because sometimes you can take direct inspiration from things. You know, you hear something somewhere that sounds good, you want to put the same technique in your own work. Other times you don't really notice yourself taking inspiration from anything. Sometimes it turns out you've taken quite a lot of inspiration from something, and perhaps even too much. I can't think offhand of any instances, but I've definitely done that before. Realised afterwards that this sounds a lot like that song I like. Oh dear. But, you know, sometimes you don't need to take inspiration from a specific source. You can just mess around with sounds within the DAW, see what works, and come up with something at the other end. There you go, that's that big dramatic boom, 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 to end the track. And then it peters out into this. And that is a quote of this oud bit, which has actually been playing in the background at the end of every chorusy bit. And I thought, what the heck, it's the end of the track, I'll make that a bit more prominent by adding some more instruments. You can see I didn't even bother to rename these things. When you get to the end of a track, you kind of feel a bit lazy. And then another one, an octave down, adds it again. And I considered ending it here, but I'd already created this sort of end bit. And it's the same bit that we're used to, just with... So it starts with like an F, because the F's in the B flat minor chord. But then the F goes down to an E, then down to a D. Black and yellow, black and yellow. So you have that kind of stepwise motion there as a sort of signal to it ending. And then somehow, out of all that, it ends on a B and a B. A B flat and a D, which is very nearly a B flat major chord. So we started off on a B flat minor chord. We went through most of it with B flat minor, occasional B flat majors, occasional wild forays into other weird tonalities. But we end on a nice happy note, a sort of corruption of where we started out, on a B flat major chord. Doesn't it make you feel that everything is right with the world? I'm sorry, I've been doing this for over an hour now. So yeah, that's how it ends. I guess that's everything about the progression of the track and the kind of melodies. Do we need to say much? Oh, that's the reason why I had that reverb. Yeah, no. Ah, okay. Sorry, I completely forgot why that was there. But you see, it turns on. It turns on around here. And that means there's extra reverb for this last bit where it's just playing on its own. And that's quite a good thing to... Well, it's a thing I like to do at the end of tracks, is kind of fade off into reverb. Because I don't really like sort of conventional fade-ins and fade-outs of tracks. Well, not necessarily tracks, but like instruments. I feel it's a bit crude. Whereas fading into something else, which is itself kind of fading into the background, is a lot nicer, I feel. And I do that a lot with filtering. You know, I will filter. I'll do this sort of thing where I perhaps filter up that way or filter down that way to remove frequencies from the track in kind of a different way, a more interesting way. So yeah, that's the whole track. Should I talk about any of the production stuff? Because I feel I've mostly focused on music theory here. The trouble with this track is it's very acoustic sounding, so there's not much to say in terms of effects. But I guess there's still some effects here and there to make it sound a bit better. You know, you can still bring out the best in any acoustic recording, or acoustic samples in this case. So an occasional delay on some tracks. It's a guitar amp, more delay. Oh yeah, I put distortion on the strings. And that might seem a weird choice. But without it, I felt it was kind of a bit sort of dull. And not dull as in boring, but dull as in like lacking high frequencies. So I decided, well, I'm going to put this one on. And it feels a lot richer. It's kind of... That's an interesting thing about distortion. It corrupts a sound, but it corrupts it in a way that perhaps makes it, you know, more favourable to us. You know, we for some reason quite like sounds that are a bit broken. Not too broken, but slightly broken sounds we're quite attracted to. Maybe that says something about us as humans. Oh dear. Occasional other things. Yeah, I really did not put many effects on these as well. This was definitely very much like a composition rather than a production, I guess. The instruments themselves, I guess, could talk about those. All of these, well, apart from that one, all from Contact. I've touched on that. Touched on those. I think I've gone through most of these. And most of the important points. One thing I think... I don't know whether this has been any help whatsoever to anyone. I probably rambled for a lot on a lot of things that didn't really matter to most people. But, you know, if at least one person finds this helpful in composing for Thrive or for other stuff, then I hope my limited knowledge has been of use. I would not consider myself a professional in this in any case. I don't know, I'm in the middle somewhere. I've been doing this for what, 7 years now? 7, yeah, I guess. The first thing I published on my YouTube channel was 2012. I was composing stuff before that, but it was all... none of it was using Cubase or any proper audio system like this. It was all in MuseScore and Synthesia and stuff. So, I guess I've had quite a bit of experience now. I could have dedicated myself more to it over that time, but I've had a life to live, you know. I've been at school and college and university. So, but I've persisted. And if you go back and look at my older stuff, which I occasionally do, just because I'm a narcissistic, I don't know, narcissistic twit, I go back and listen to them. And sometimes I find, this is better than I remembered. Why can't I do this stuff now? And sometimes I listen to things and think, yeah, no, this is terrible. You were justified in moving on from this. And you can definitely tell that I've gotten better. Just years of practice and figuring out my own way. And the main advice I would give to anyone starting out with this sort of thing is don't go seeking feedback immediately, I guess, because you have to develop an intuitive sense of what is good and what isn't. Because if you don't have that, if you're in the middle of creating something like this, you can't really go and ask someone, hey, is this sounding good or is this sounding good? I guess you can, but it's not the same. You know, if you want to ask someone, does it sound better if I reduce the compressor's threshold to this monstrosity? And then send them 2 audio tracks for 2 different things, you know. You can't do that for every single creative decision you make. You need to have an understanding of what happens. And incidentally, what does this sound like? That's just been compressed within an inch of its life. Oh well. Don't do that. Don't ever put the threshold down or compressor down here. If you ask someone, hey, what does this sound like with a compressor threshold down here? They'll tell you you're an idiot. But yeah, my point is that you need to understand for yourself what's good and what's not, and that can only come from practice, reflecting on your own work. Eventually, you can go and ask for feedback from people. It's difficult. I don't know. I personally find it difficult giving feedback to complete amateurs. I'm fine giving feedback to people who know their stuff, because I can pinpoint a thing and say, oh, you should have added more reverb here, or this should have, more high EQ or whatever. Whereas if you're talking to someone who's just starting out, they don't really know why that would be a thing to do. That sometimes they don't even know what that is. What that means. Incidentally. Yeah, no, this really was not a production track, because the only bit of automation that's the thing that changes plugins and instruments along the way is turning that reverb on at the end. Well, so yeah, I'll try and give feedback if you do submit things, but it's difficult, as you can probably tell. I hope you've enjoyed this. I kind of have, I guess. It's been an interesting experiment. I don't know whether I'm going to do more in future. If people want more in future, I will. If you have any specific requests of tracks you'd like me to go through, then leave them in the comments. I don't really expect many people to watch this. It's going to be many hours long, and mostly me just talking about stuff. So, I'm not a very interesting person. So I can't imagine many people would have stayed this long. If you have, thank you very much. If not, screw you. But you can't hear me anyway, so it's fine. Yeah, I have no closing comments. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching for once. I will see you next time, I guess. Goodbye.